A new leader. 906. With the death of Red Scorpion's Chapter Master and loyalist Magister Militum, Verant Ortis, the strategic initiatives was temporarily delivered into the hands of the secessionists, and raids against Imperial shipping increased. For a time, the Loyalists were sorely pressed to hold what little ground they had taken in the Maelstrom Zone. The Pale Stars were all but entirely cut off, and heavy Space Marine escort forces were required in order to maintain access to the worlds of the Gallian and the Chimarga. The situation was finally eased with the arrival of contingents of the Howling Griffins, Nova Marines, and later Sons of Medusa chapters, and the appointment of Karbal Kun, the new Lord High Commander of the Red Scorpions, as the new Magister Militum of the Loyalist forces. As his chapter defines such things, Cullen had grown forthright, proud, and above all fiercely loyal to the Red Scorpions during his illustrious career. For this reason, Cullen was viewed as the natural successor of Lord High Commander Verant Ortis. During the Badab War, his transition to the position of Lord High Commander and Magister Militum after the death of Ortis on the world of grief at the hands of the Renegade Astral Claws was greeted with wide acclaim by his battle brothers, and most importantly, blessed by the chapter's chief librarian, Servin Lucht, who oversaw the change of command and quelled any dissent. Cullen's accession had been contested primarily by the Firehawk's chapter master, Stibor Lazarek, who demanded that he instead should be granted overall command of the Loyalist forces in the conflict as Magister Militum, due to his seniority and long honorable service to the Imperium. As Ortiz' successor, Cullen was entitled to step into the mantle of his predecessor as Magister Militum and overall commander of the Loyalist forces. But this was by no means guaranteed. With the principal support of the Raptors and Salamanders chapters, as well as his own impassioned pleas in the Loyalist War Council that he had the right of vengeance and the proven mettle required to see the war to its end, Cullen secured the support of the Fire Angels and Nova Marines for his command. Both the Sons of Medusa and the Marines Errant chapters then agreed to his selection for reasons of their own. Despite some continued minor dissent, Karab Cullen was acclaimed as the second Magister Militum of the Imperial Crusade to retake the Maelstrom Zone from the secessionists. Cullen quickly took control of the situation and brought forward plans to convert the old way station of the largely abandoned mining world of Hallows Point into the first primary Loyalist base and staging point in the Maelstrom Zone proper. With starships and materials moved into the system with great dispatch, Vengeance Station, as it became known, was fully operational in under a standard year. The Loyalists retook the offensive initiative even before Vengeance Station was completed. Soon, a renewed phase of aggressive operations was ready to take place, with the Red Scorpions chapter particularly eager for battle. However, their eagerness was tempered by their new master and the wise counsel of Chief Librarian Servin Lot, who promised their battle brothers a bloody but carefully considered retribution. Loyalist redeployment, 906. By the close of 906, dozens of separate void actions had already been fought by the Red Scorpions detachments, ranging from defending convoys to raiding outposts and intercepting secessionist shipping alongside the Raptors, turning the tide against Huron's raiders for the first time. At the same time, the Loyalists were bolstered by fresh forces from the Nova Marines and Sons of Medusa chapters, who immediately carried out probing attacks into the region of the Endymion cluster and against the edges of the Saga system, maintaining pressure on the secessionists and keeping their forces pinned down. During this new campaign, the Loyalists garrisoned the barren Chimara system and established several outposts and listening stations in order to conduct sustained operations in the contested Gargatea system. Gargatea 3. Hope I don't have to pronounce this a lot. Gargatea 3 was a feral world of poisonous fens and corrosive jungles, This heavily contested world soon turned into a savage battleground as the Raptors, Salamanders, and Fire Angels chapter clashed against the Astral Claws and Mantis warriors amidst the tangled and often lethal vegetation. The war on Gargatea swiftly developed into a series of hit-and-run engagements of ambush and counterattack. The battle lines on Gargatea remained non-linear, save for a few scattered landmarks of half-overrun explorator bases and old smugglers' outposts. The outcome of such vicious fighting was uncertain, and a high amount of casualties were sustained on both sides. Gargatea remained a constant world of vital strategic importance due to the planet being one of the few life-sustaining worlds in the region. The successionist forces were finally displaced from this planet at the end of 907, and the system reclaimed for the Loyalists. Loyalist reinforcement 907. With the arrival of fresh reinforcements to replace them in the order of battle, the Marines errant first took up reserve duty for the remainder of 906, before they finally withdrew entirely from the Badab War in early 907, with some acrimony attached to their departure. The Firehawks chapter, who grew increasingly embittered, were forcibly retired to the rear guard for a time by the newly appointed Magister Militum, Lord High Commander Karab Kolan, in order to avoid further trouble in the ranks of the Loyalist forces. This redeployment of the Firehawks was proved particularly effective, as the presence of the mighty Raptorus Rex at the Hallows Point ensured the security of the Loyalist facility while under construction. The presence of the mobile Star Fortress soon proved vital when Hallows Point was raided in late 906 by secessionist vessels led by a trio of Lamenters Chapter strike cruisers. The attack was repulsed without major damage to the half-finished base, and Anchorage, as the concentrated firepower of both the Raptorus Rex and the Red Scorpion's battle barge, Sword of Ordon, proved a decisive factor. The scales began to tip in the Loyalists' favor, as further reinforcements arrived almost solar month by solar month, with missives from the Adeptus Terra, informing them that the other Space Marines chapter were en route. Lord High Commander Colin knew that he must press his advantage soon, or risk the war devolving into a slow battle of attrition that would bleed his forces dry. The first move forwards would be the relief of the fortress world of Suringarad that stubbornly held out against the secessionist aggression by their heroic self-sacrifice and single bloody-minded faith in the God Emperor. The Raptors and Salamanders chapters were assigned the task of intervention by sending a select strike force dispatched on a long-range incursion mission behind the secessionist lines. The Raptors covertly landed a strong force of Battle Brothers in field-modified armor over 300 kilometers away from their chosen target. Shunning heavy gear and vehicles in favor of reduced visibility to auspex and thermal detectors, the Raptors' war party launched a lightning assault under the cover of blinding gale, and succeeded in breaching the fortress walls of the main orbital defense complex with meltabombs, gaining entrance. They then successfully sabotaged the base's weapon silo, despite taking heavy casualties from a bitterly contested counterattack by the Astral Claws. With the way open, the two chapters' battle barges bombarded the planet from the upper atmosphere, smashing the secessionist held positions into surrender and liberating Suringard. The liberation of Suringard marked a turning point in the war, as the Loyalists began to drive a potential wedge down the middle of the secessionist worlds. But before they could take an advantage of this new gain, dire news came from the Howling Griffins stationed at Kirma. Of a deadly new threat. Huron's sins uncovered. 907, surprisingly. inquisitorial interrogation of an Astral Claws apothecary captured during the battle for Sungard's polar fortress revealed to the general shock of the interrogators that the prisoner was not in fact an Astral Claw by origin at all, but was in fact a former member of the Tiger Claws, a chapter long thought lost. The Astral Claws' hubris resulted in their chapter secretly absorbing the remnants of their long-lost successor chapter into their ranks and ultimately led to Huron's dream of expanding his chapter into a force with the strength of one of the Space Marine legions of antiquity, in order to pacify the Maelstrom permanently and crush mankind's enemies. Some Imperial scholars contend that when the last remaining Tiger Claws survivors were taken into the Astral Claws' midst, these once loyal brothers grasped the poisonous viper to their hearts, thus causing them to eventually fall from grace. Further dire and extreme interrogative methods were then unleashed in utter secrecy, as a planned series of stalk and capture raids were engaged upon by covert Astartes and Inquisition forces operating within the Maelstrom Zone. Evidence was quickly amassed of an unforeseen and terrible heresy that had been pursued by the Astral Claws and Huron for more than a standard century. The Tyrant of Badab had ordered the withholding of his chapter's gene seed tides to the Magos Invigia, whatever, I forgot how I used to pronounce this, not to replenish the chapter's own losses, but at first in order to help save the remnants of the decimated ranks of their near-extinct kin, the Tiger Claws Chapter, which had sought sanctuary with them in secret. Huron and his fellows hid them within the Astral Claws' own ranks. He then further compounded this sin by seeking to expand his own forces far past the levels mandated by the Codex Astartes. For at least 100 standard years before the outbreak of the conflict, the Astral Claw secretly attempted to transform their chapter slowly into a force equal to a Space Marine legion of old. In his monumental arrogance and pride, Huron sought at first not to rebel against the Imperium, but to prove his case by scourging the Maelstrom clean and establishing a new realm carved out for mankind in the name of the Emperor. To outside scrutiny, the Tyrant of Badab placed Astral Claws detachments within the Tyrant's legion's ranks before the outbreak of the war as trainers, tasked with the purging and improvement of the mediocre and often corrupt PDF armies of the Badab sector. But in reality, the Legion's Astartes tribunes were in all cases passed off as the force's commanders. This perfidy succeeded in concealing the true numbers of the Tyrant's growing chapter from prying eyes, and enabled the Astral Claws to disperse these hidden forces all across Huron's domain, hidden within the Tyrant's legion. The perfidy of the Tyrant of Badab and the Astral Claws rapidly became apparent when the Badab War engulfed the Maelstrom Zone, as did the identity of the true commanders of the Tyrant's legion, who willingly followed their master without falter, taking up arms against any who would challenge the Tyrant's domain. Further covert investigation uncovered that the Astral Claws apothecaries had also been conducting heretical experiments in rapid gene seed zygote cultivation. While largely unsuccessful, thanks to the use of its untied gene seed, the Astral Claws chapter stood at around an estimated 3,500 battle brothers strong. The axe fall at Chimara. That's worse than Jehera. Here we stand, and here we shall die, unbroken and unbowed. Though the very hand of death itself come for us, we will spit our defiance to the end. Revered Ancient Arman Titus of the Howling Griffins chapter during the last stand of Chimara Ellipsis. A disastrous defeat for the Loyalist forces in early 907 would make the bloodiest year of the conflict, for the bulk of the Executioner's chapter had arrived in force in the Maelstrom Zone and immediately conducted an immediate surprise attack at Chimara. They succeeded in destroying the Loyalist outposts, listening stations, and the vital astropathic relay complex on the night moons of the Chimara system in one stroke. The Howling Griffins chapter forces garrisoning the Kimara system were outnumbered and overwhelmed, suffering greatly as their bastions and stations fell one after the other despite their tenacious defense. The Howling Griffins were systematically destroyed by the relentless onslaught of the executioners from an unseen quarter. As the Howling Griffins' positions were being overrun and decimated, on the airless dust moon, it fell to the dreadnought confessor, Armand Titus, to rally the beleaguered forces of his chapter. Unafraid of the firestorm around him, with impeccable zeal, the venerable chaplain dreadnought led the desperate counterattack which bought his chapter the chance to regroup and mount an effective fighting defense at the cost of his long life. After the executioners had finally withdrawn from the battlefield, the surviving Howling Griffins found that their foe had honored Titus's glorious sacrifice by laying out the wreck of his sarcophagus with a ring of broken weapons, placing one of their own shattered standards in the lifeless grasp of the fallen war machine. The death of the revered dreadnought confessor Titus struck a hammer blow to the Howling Griffins' morale. With the Kimara system's defense platforms and listening stations destroyed, the executioners had achieved their primary objective. They could have pressed their advantage and utterly destroyed the Howling Griffins' outpost, but instead withdrew suddenly from the system, leaving the Howling Griffins' garrison with more than 70% casualties. This development provoked much consternation from Huron, but mindful of the dangerous temperament of the executioner's commander, the High Chaplain Tusula Kane, he was known to have stopped short of issuing any formal reprimand to them, and instead welcomed them into the battle for the successionist cause. Despite the grievous losses dealt to them, the remainder of the Howling Griffins task force continued to doggedly fight on, refusing to shrink away from the responsibilities to the Loyalist cause until formally relieved from the war in 909. Enemies unlooked for. Oh, you're gonna like this one. Taking advantage of the anarchy that reigned within the Maelstrom Zone, it was unsurprising that attacks from unaligned raiding forces and Xenos species based within the turbulence expanse of the Maelstrom dramatically increased, reaching a new height during the 907th year. The Successionists suffered the worst at the hands of these non-aligned forces during the Badab War. A large Orc corsair fleet spilled forth from the Kalak system, assaulting Successionist supply convoys between the Endymion cluster and the Badab sector, and ultimately assaulted the Mantis warriors at Endymion itself. A large force of over 20,000 green-skinned boys proceeded to slaughter the planet's meager garrison, forcing the Mantis warriors' forces to pull back to defend Endymion and meet the Orcs in a rapid-moving land battle on the dust plains of Orella, lest they would lose the world. As serious as the Orc attack against the cluster was, there was a far worse implication of the growing threat of the demon-tainted Corsair cults based on the blighted world of Magog. Their increase in power had actually reinforced the recently defeated Orcs. This forced the Successionists to launch a direct assault on the hellish world, which despite the prior Exterminatus campaign had long remained a thorn in the Maelstrom Warder's side. Koirin Sumatris, one of Huron's most seasoned battle captains, commanded an Astral Claws battle barrage and conducted the attack on Magog. A force of 2 companies of the chapter and a strong force of hand-picked Astral Claws and Lamenter's Terminators successfully cut off the threat while it was still forming. The Tyrant of Badab knew well they could ill afford the risk of fighting a war on 2 fronts if they continued to allow the dire threat on Magog to continue to grow. Though a costly diversion that caused a high number of fatalities, the Successionists were able to reinforce their flank just as a new enemy entered the conflict. And this one's going to be the worst one of them all. Wrath of the Minotaurs. The powerful fleet-based chapter of dark renown, the Minotaurs arrived in full strength in the Maelstrom Zone in mid-907. They announced their presence in the war by launching a full chapter-scale assault on the secessionist-controlled mining facility on Cairo, wiping out 46,000-strong Tyrant's Legion garrison and rendering the mine works unusable. Afterwards, the Minotaurs sent a starship with representatives and officially presented themselves to the Loyalist Council of War. Their master, the darkly famed Astarion Moloch, remained with his chapter to raid through the Pale Stars region in order to decimate, rather than conquer, a pre-planned list of resource production within the region in order to starve the secessionist war effort. While the Minotaurs chapter ceded overall strategic authority to the War Council of the Loyalist chapters already engaged in the conflict, they deliberately stayed largely aloof and distant from its general chain of command, distancing themselves from the other chapters, as was their wont, and deferring to the Legate Inquisitor's authority more often than that of the Lord High Commander Caraban Colin or his advisors. This distance was shown in their standing representative to the War Council, the gaunt, brooding, and taciturn chaplain Ivanus Encomi, whose red-rimmed eyes observed all, although he barely spoke a word during the gatherings. The Minotaur's chapter master, Astarion Moloch, never put in a personal appearance at these councils, and the only evidence that he served during the Badab conflict at all came from picked footage recovered from battle scans and fearful stories spread by the few secessionist survivors of the Minotaurs' brutal attacks. The Minotaurs had come in answer to the direct summons from the acting Legate Inquisitor for more Space Marines to join the Loyalist cause against the secessionist chapters. Though the arrival of their savage chapter was cautiously welcomed by the Loyalists, they undoubtedly couldn't deny the considerable strength that would be added to the Imperium's cause. The conflict was in its fourth standard year of open warfare, and the Minotaurs committed their strength to the war. 10 companies and 11 capital ships of various types. While the chapter coordinated their efforts with the Loyalist command, they operated largely independent throughout the conflict, striking targets as they saw fit. The Minotaurs attacked indiscriminately, assaulting not only the 30-plus secessionist-controlled minor worlds and the void stations, but also overlooked independent minor outposts, operating largely independently in the southern Maelstrom Zone. The Minotaurs proceeded to strike targets amidst the Pale Stars and Dini Stellar Drift border regions. The viciousness of the chapter's reputation for leaving no survivors among those that resisted them quickly grew, and remained uncontested until the arrival of the even more savage Carcadon's chapter. Only the warships and strike forces of the executioners seemed able to halt the Minotaurs' progress within the region, the two chapters seemingly relishing the battle between them as a kind of bloody sport. For the remainder of the year, the Minotaurs gained several important victories for the Loyalist cause, destroying the Tyrant's Legion force on Crow's World and Larsa, and forced the Astral Claws to withdraw or risk having their worlds isolated and ravaged one by one. Within 1/3 of a standard year of the Minotaurs' arrival in the region, the direct and collateral damage caused by their forces reduced the human population of the Pale Stars alone by more than 20%. The power of this chapter quickly proved a decisive weight in the Loyalists' favor, regardless of his brutal methods. By the end of 907, the secessionist forces had begun to be pushed back from several key star systems and suffered severe losses in the north and central Maelstrom Zone. The battle for Galen between the Astral Claws and a joint force of Salamanders and Fire Angels eventually resulted in the Loyalists successfully taking the system. To further add to the secessionists' dreadful losses was the loss of the world of Vinaya, which finally fell after a massive joint assault by the Minotaurs and Red Scorpion chapters. Huron had all but abandoned the world, and the sizable Tyrant's Legion garrison stationed there to their fate. As the angels of death fell amongst the beleaguered defenders, their end was swift and brutal. And by dawn, Vanaya was in loyalist hands, as the tyrant's legion was put to the sword. Scourging of Syngax. In the early 908, yes, we're getting there, inquisitorial agents had acquired evidence of a plot between the Astral Claws and renegade heretic scavengers from the Golgothan Waste. They had devised a plan to acquire recovered buried weapon stores on the dead world of Syngax. The Sons of Medusa task force, backed by a newly arrived company from the Exorcist chapter, were given this task. Given the chief role in this task, the Sons of Medusa led a determined and brutal campaign to scour out the Tyrant of Badab's forces, the conduct of which caused some discord between the two chapters, with accusations that the Sons of Medusa were more interested in pursuing their own mysterious agenda instead of hunting down the enemy as expeditiously as possible. The Exorcists soon withdrew and redeployed their forces for the forthcoming assault on the Sagan system, leaving the Sons of Medusa to eliminate the Synax threat as they saw fit. The Second Battle of Sagan. The Second Battle of Sagan was a major planetary assault undertaken in 908 that drove the secessionists from their fortresses in the Sagan subsector. The assault was carried out by the largest combined loyalist force fielded to that point during the Badab War. This offensive utilized the mass strength of the Fire Angels, Red Scorpions, and Exorcist chapters, supported by assault specialized forces drawn from the Salamanders, Raptors, and Nova Marines. The secessionists chose to mount a defense at any cost rather than giving up the strategically vital Sagan system. I'm thinking about Yu-Gi-Oh! For a reason. The fighting proved to be bloody and costly in the extreme. In a desperate attempt to either drive the loyalists from the surface of Sagan III or render the planet unusable to them, the Astral Claws resorted to the use of viral weapons that slew tens of thousands of the world's population. This use of weapons of mass destruction ultimately destroyed a sizable component of the secessionists' own battle line. The Fire Angels deployed their full chapter strength and bore the brunt of the loyalist casualties valiantly, sacrificing themselves in order to contain the Astral Claws' desperate final attempts to drive their foes from the world through the utilization of suicide attacks. This campaign resulted in the highest death toll of any single engagement of the war to this point in the conflict, as well as the loss of several key secessionist warships in a vain counterattack on the system. The successful loyalist invasion of the Sagan system proved to be a major turning point of the war. After the system fell under loyalist control, it became the primary Imperial base in the Maelstrom Zone, affording the loyalists offensive greater access to the primary stable warp routes into the region while denying those routes to the enemy. Shortly after the end of the campaign, Sagan III was used as a supply point in order to fully relieve and reinforce the world of Cerngard and support the start of the Endymion suppression campaign. This loyalist advance effectively forced the remaining Mantis Warriors forces into a purely defensive posture, isolating them from the Badab sector and their secessionist allies. After the Second Battle of Sagan, the Maelstrom Zone was effectively split into two regions, the Endymion cluster and the still heavily defended Badab sector itself. From this point onwards in the conflict, the secessionists were only able to conduct commerce raids and targeted strikes, which were carried out by the vessels of the Executioners and Lamenters chapter fleets. Beyond the difficulties possessed to the Imperium by the ongoing Badab War, the safety of the Ultima Segmentum was also threatened at this time by massive orc incursions after multiple wars erupted across the eastern fringe of the galaxy. With the secessionists having been judged sufficiently contained after the victory at Sagan III, the Loyalists redeployed the chapters that had suffered battlefield attrition to some degree to deal with the green screen threat. The redeployment included the forces of the Nova Marines, Raptors, and Howling Griffins chapter. They were withdrawn one by one from the conflict in managed stages as part of a major Imperium-wide strategic redeployment, along with a number of warships of the Imperial Navy's Segmentum Solar reserve forces, which had been deployed in support of the Loyalist cause.